Hello there. Welcome to our second episode of the RestorationCast live broadcast.
Not even going to let me say hello. He
I'm
just
sorry.
kind of cuts me off like I'm just... they call me... What was it Daryl called me the other day?
Color?
Comedy. Color comedy. No.
So, you call yourself color commentary.
Color comedy. Yeah, that's what I think of myself as color commentary. I think he thinks of me as comedy relief or something like that.
That could be. I didn't talk to him.
You didn't talk to him about that?
No, I didn't.
Yeah.
So,
Here we are. Snowed this morning. I couldn't believe it. I got up this morning. It's Sunday morning. Got up, getting ready to do all my lessons and all that kind of thing. Went out. White.
Yeah, he has to get up, I guess, an hour or something earlier than I do.
I'm the man.
Sunday morning, so I was still laying in bed, and he comes and knocks on my door and says, "Are you guys gonna go?"
What's the deal? Yeah. It was just a dusting. It was a pretty good dusting, but it had that kind of thin ice underneath of it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? That could be tragic.
Can be.
It can be.
We made it all the way to
You made it.
Boyd's so
Yeah.
You didn't make it.
I didn't make it. They canceled on me.
Yeah.
I did my live stuff right here in this very office. Yeah, but I got my jacket on, son. It's football season. I've always been a Steelers fan, but I'm just really wearing it because I'm cold. They didn't make the playoffs, and so it doesn't really matter. But go Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I don't know anything about football. So.
That's okay. It's all right because I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I do know something about football.
Mm-hmm.
College level, Nittany Lions, Penn State. Professional level, my side of the state, it was always Pittsburgh Steelers. The other side of the state, it's the Eagles from Philadelphia. But nah. Anyhow, go on. What are we doing next, son?
I think maybe we should start another podcast where you talk about football and I can be the
I like
commentary.
it. Do you have any color to commentary?
I don't have any color to commentary.
Yeah, we better not do that.
That was pretty much my whole line.
Well, we better just stick with what we know then.
All right. So today we're talking about Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
As you can probably see up on the screen, Jerusalem is probably the most important city ever.
I agree.
And it's kind of interesting because it kind of comes from, I don't know that I'd say humble beginnings, but you read the first 5 books of the Old Testament, really more than that. You include Joshua, Judges, Ruth. It's not until you get into, I guess, 2 Samuel, whenever David becomes king, that Jerusalem has any real significance.
Yeah.
So, it's not really that significant until well into the Old Testament. But once it becomes significant, it becomes very significant.
Very, very, very significant. So much so that it almost... Oh, hey, hold on, folks. We got company. We got to make room here. And our tiny... It's my wife. I love this woman so much. Come here, honey. Come here. This is... You got to...
Oh.
She came to visit me. Hey, while we got her here, let's sing that song. You know that one about the mountains?
Mm-hmm.
We're dealing with Jerusalem and everything, you know? Go over there and stand, honey, because you don't have much space over here. This crazy look. Look here. Grabs his guitar like it was planned.
Like it was, yeah.
You guys are going to like this. You didn't know we're going to break into song on a podcast, but here it is.
As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people. Surround us, Lord. Surround us, oh Lord. We need to be in your presence. Surround us, Lord.
Ouch. Way to go, guys. For an impromptu planned it to do it that way kind of thing, we did pretty good. Thanks, honey, for jumping in here. She really was reluctant. Cindy doesn't like to be on the big screen, but all right, honey, you ready? I'll open the door. It's really crowded here. Thanks, honey, for joining us. We love you.
I love you too.
All right, so as the mountains surround Jerusalem, that was my lead in.
Yeah, that was good, Dad. That was real clever.
Thank you.
All right, so let's talk about a little bit of brief history of Jerusalem here.
All right.
So, as I mentioned before, Jerusalem doesn't start off as being like all that important. So it's mentioned twice in the Pentateuch, which
in the whole Pentateuch.
For the whole Pentateuch, it's only mentioned twice. It's not mentioned again until Joshua, and that basically is just to say we captured it.
I didn't even. So 5 books, and it's not even mentioned.
Yeah. So
I mean, it's only mentioned twice.
It's only mentioned twice.
And it's kind of in passing, isn't it? It's not even really kind of direct. So.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to talk about one of those because it's the first mention of the place. So I figured we should talk about the first one, and the last one. Anyway, so the first mention of Jerusalem, it's called Salem. That's where Melchizedek lives. He's a king of Salem, and then he's a priest of God. And he comes out and he blesses Abraham. We'll talk about that one. The second one is Jerusalem. Actually, the temple is built on top of Mount Moriah.
Oh, yeah.
So whenever we get into First Kings and Solomon is building the temple, it's going to describe where he's placing the temple. It's going to say it's on Mount Moriah. So we know Jerusalem has to be in this same area where Mount Moriah is. But Mount Moriah is also the place where Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac, sort of. It says, go to the land of Moriah, and then he goes up on a mountain to do the sacrifice. So you kind of put 2 and 2 together. It's
right.
Same mountain.
So for being a podunk, only gets mentioned twice in the Pentateuch, it becomes a pretty historically central place. It's got a lot of history attached to it.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at those 2 stories, they're not, at least Isaac being sacrificed, that's a pretty significant story.
Sure.
The story of Melchizedek, is very brief, and yet, from a New Testament standpoint, like all of Hebrews 7 is about Melchizedek. He's mentioned several more times in Hebrews, so, and then he's mentioned once in Psalms. So, there's kind of some significant stories that are happening in this place, even though it's only mentioned twice.
Yeah.
So, and both times it's kind of mentioned in passing.
And when I hope I'm not stealing your thunder here, because he doesn't share his slides with me ahead of time. That's why I'm color. I'm just winging it as I go here. But you get to the other end of the book, and it becomes crazy prominent. It opens up like no problem. Then at the end of the book of Revelation, we've got it paralleling the idea of the heavenly existence.
Yeah.
So, and maybe you're going to talk about that.
Yeah,
are you? Oh, sorry about that,
That's
son.
Okay.
Hey, let's give a shout out real quick, if I can.
All right.
Your grandparents, my parents are watching, and I noticed when I saw that, I said to myself, a lot of what that kid knows about Jerusalem in that area comes from my dad. His grandpa, Norman, who's watching. And so shout out to Norman for that. You become the 3rd generation of preacher boys.
It's true.
So shout out to my dad. 85 years old, still kicking. Love that guy.
Hi there, Grandpa.
All right.
And Grandma.
Grandma, I love her because she cooks for me.
She also gave birth to you. So
she gave birth to me.
You should probably appreciate her.
And you wouldn't be here if I didn't get given birth to.
That's true.
Me by her.
Yeah, so important person.
Yeah.
All right, so it's mentioned twice in the Pentateuch. As I said before, it's mentioned a couple other times later on, but nothing really significant until David captures it. And he decides to make it the capital of Israel, which is kind of odd, I think. I mean, I don't know why he makes this decision to make Jerusalem the capital. Because, as we pointed out, there hasn't been really any significance to Jerusalem up until this point.
Yeah, you kind of wonder why he didn't choose Bethlehem. That's his birthplace and all that. I think, if I remember, your grandpa and my dad, it seemed like one of the reasons David chose it is because of the mountain setting, that it was easily fortified.
Yeah, which, that's definitely true. It seems like That's kind of the idea here. So if you look at Jerusalem, and that's really the thing that it's got going for it, right? Is it's like up on this I guess you'd call it a mountain. It's surrounded on all sides. It's kind of in the hill country.
Yeah.
And so it's not particularly accessible, which is very good for someone like David, who is this warrior king that he's going out and leading in battles and all of these different things. He wants a fortress city to be his capital. What doesn't make sense is the fact that it kind of stays that way.
Yeah.
Right. Like Solomon comes along, he's like this economic leader rather than this war hero like his father was, and so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that Jerusalem would stay the capital, because at this point we're in a time of peace, and Jerusalem isn't really, again, it's not accessible, right? So that makes it good for a fortress, and yet it's not really on any trade routes or anything along those lines, and so it's not really good economically. It's not near any really good farmland because, again, it's in the hill country. It's up on a mountain. So it's, not really, it doesn't have a lot going for it other than the fact that it's, kind of this impregnable fortress, which is a good thing. And it becomes kind of the thing that Jerusalem is known for. Kind of the pride of Israel is the fact that Jerusalem is so impregnable. And it comes in handy later on. Right?
Yeah.
Like, Sennacherib's coming and trying to take over Jerusalem, and they go through several different sieges. And if Jerusalem was a little bit easier to capture, then things probably would not have worked out for them earlier on. Then they end up imploding. So
imploding's a good word. It's exactly what happened. They imploded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that kind of becomes one of the themes of Scripture, I think, is that the Jews trust in Jerusalem so much. They think that nothing can happen to them because Jerusalem's not going to fall, largely because God is there, right? And so they think it can't fall, and God basically just keeps saying, no, I can take this away from you, and I have the power to do that. And so if they repent, like Hezekiah does, he leads this this revolution back to God, essentially, and so God, he doesn't destroy Jerusalem at that time, but then eventually they do go all the way, and they do get destroyed.
You mentioned something earlier I wanted to kind of pick up on, that it wasn't along a major trade route, and yet we said last week that Israel, all the world goes through Israel.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to clarify that that is true of Israel, but like you say, because Jerusalem's at the top of a mountain or whatever, it wasn't really where you would stop first unless there's a city there.
Yeah.
So you kind of had to struggle to get to it. You would take an entirely different route if you're just going through Israel, but because of Jerusalem being there, blessed by God, he names the city, he names the place as being a spot that is sacred, and like you said, with the temple and etc., it becomes a pretty big deal.
Yeah. I was reading in my studies about Jerusalem's geography and everything. I don't remember how far it was, but it basically said that Jerusalem was just a few miles from a major trade route. So there are these trade routes in Israel, definitely, but it kind of described it as like these arteries that are going and crisscrossing through Israel, and Jerusalem just happens to not be on top of one.
Yeah, right. Right.
It's kind of this odd thing. Anyway, so David makes Jerusalem his capital, and then Solomon, his son, he builds the temple in Jerusalem, which is largely because of David's desires, right?
Right.
David is the one that asks God if he can build this temple, and God's like, no, your son's going to do it, and then David kind of prepares the way for Solomon to build the temple. And so I guess you could kind of get the idea that maybe Solomon, if not for his father's influence, would have moved the capital to
you wonder
somewhere else, but he doesn't. So he builds the temple in Jerusalem.
For instance, Caesarea,
mm-hmm.
right on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and all those kind of things. It's along the trade route from north to south and south to north, going down into Egypt or going up into Asia Minor, that kind of thing. We don't have the map up here. I'd have pointed to it. But yeah, you know, I can see Solomon saying, "Hey," because he imported a lot of stuff. I can see Solomon saying, "Yeah, Caesarea, let's do that one, port city, etc." But it doesn't change. It's even interesting that Jerusalem is only a little distance from the Jordan River, certainly within walking distance of the Jordan River, which is, you know, like you say, a trade path back in the day, that kind of a thing. But it's not on the Jordan River.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean that's kind of one of the things that, at least I think, you know, most big cities have in common. Like important cities is usually they're near the ocean, right?
Right.
And if they're not near the ocean, they're usually near like some body of water.
Exactly.
Like, you know, Memphis is on
Mississippi
River.
Little Rock. Arkansas River.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, most of these important cities would be like really close to bodies of water. Jerusalem, as you pointed out, it's near the Jordan River, but it's not actually like, you would expect it to be like more like right on the Jordan
Especially
River.
Back in that day when travel was so much more difficult.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that Jerusalem has going for it is it has springs. So they have their own water source, which made it a little bit more difficult for them to, like, you know, for sieges to happen, I guess. Because, you know, we have water. So you can't really do much about that. But yeah, they're not like on this actual body of water that people could travel on. And so they're not really getting the trade there, but they have the water, so I guess they don't need it, or something.
Are we going to talk about Hezekiah's tunnel? That would tickle your grandpa if we talked about Hezekiah's tunnel.
I guess we can talk about Hezekiah's tunnel.
Oh, but you didn't have it in the notes.
I don't have it in the notes. What
next time, Grandpa,
say about Hezekiah's tunnel?
Well, maybe you can have Grandpa sit where I'm sitting, and he can tell you about it.
That's a good idea.
All right, go on.
All right, so Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, and then I got this map, by the way.
That's clever.
This is actually first century Jerusalem, but it's a map of Jerusalem. So Solomon builds the temple, and then immediately after Solomon's death, Solomon the son takes over, Rehoboam, and he is a really bad king.
He's a mess up.
Rehoboam takes over and splits the kingdom in half, or really not half.
Not half, but yeah.
I mean, Judah's pretty big, so
yeah, that's a good point.
It might have been half. Anyway, he splits the kingdom in two parts, which is not necessarily half. And Jerusalem becomes the capital of Judah, which is the southern two tribes. And then they pick a new capital, Samaria, in the north. And so Jerusalem, you know, stays this important city, only now it's important for only a couple of tribes of Israel rather than the whole nation. And that brings kind of this important story with it, because the temple is in Jerusalem at this point. Solomon's built the temple, and the country splits in half or whatever, and then God goes to the leader of the northern tribes of Israel, Jeroboam, and he says basically that if you'll be faithful to me, I'll bless you. I'll make this dynasty out of your family, and you know your descendants will be the kings of Israel forever. And Jeroboam doesn't do that because he looks at the temple in Jerusalem and he recognizes that this is the major worship center for God. And so he sets up these two golden calves in Israel so that the people will go worship there instead of going to worship in Jerusalem. Which kind of seems like maybe Jeroboam isn't really, he's almost kind of trying to do what God's saying, you know, that maybe he said, you know, I guess I'll worship you like they did back in Exodus, which obviously is the wrong way.
It didn't work out very well.
It doesn't work out for him, exactly. So Jerusalem becomes this place of like the only worship center in Israel. It becomes like the most important place, both politically and spiritually, in Judah. And so what you kind of see from that point on is that there's some good kings in Judah, right? So In this place, with Jerusalem, with the temple, there are still some good kings, and yet in Israel there are none. Nobody follows God in Israel, which is partially because the ones that do follow God come to Judah. They recognize what's going down, and they decide to go south. So, because of the unfaithfulness in Judah, that they have some good kings, and yet things are constantly going downhill. They're constantly getting worse. Because of that, Jerusalem falls in 586 BC, and all of the Jews are taken from their homeland. Well, not all of them, but most of them are taken from their homeland to Babylon, and they live there for a number of years.
Trivia question: who's the only prophet to stick around? Jeremiah. You already knew, didn't you? I try really hard to, but there's a little remnant that stays behind. But most of them, like you said, they go off to Babylonian captivity.
Yeah. So after this, the Babylonian captivity, Cyrus the Great captures Babylon. Essentially, he's Persian, and he decides that the children of Israel, the Jews, can go back to the Promised Land.
Persian, Esther. That's where you get the connection of Esther.
Yeah, so he sends them back to the Promised Land. Zerubbabel and Nehemiah are largely responsible for rebuilding the Jerusalem. Nehemiah rebuilds the walls. Zerubbabel rebuilds the temple. So they rebuild Jerusalem, essentially. Not to the level of the former glory that it had back whenever Solomon was the one that built it. But they do. They really rebuild. And that would be what this map is of, essentially.
That's what Jesus would have experienced.
Yeah, exactly. So this map up here is not a map of Jerusalem in its heyday, I guess you would say. Whenever Solomon was around, this is a map from Jesus' time. So it's a little bit different than it would have been after Nehemiah actually finished the walls. But it's the same kind of idea. This is the same Jerusalem. So then Jerusalem is this place where Jesus would have gone on several different occasions for different Jewish holidays, and eventually it's also the place where Jesus dies, right? Which is kind of an interesting connection. You might have heard preachers talk about Abraham sacrifices Isaac on the same mountain that God sacrifices his son, which is kind of true. I mean, not completely, because obviously the mountain that Abraham sacrifices Isaac is where the temple is. So Jesus isn't actually right there. He's at Golgotha, but it's true enough, I think.
Sure.
It's still an interesting idea. And then it's Jerusalem's where the early church begins.
Yes.
They're actually told, start in Jerusalem and then go to the rest of Judea, then Samaria, then to the ends of the earth. And so they kind of have this spreading out that they're supposed to do, starting in Jerusalem. And then Jerusalem falls again in AD 70.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess that one's not exactly, not mentioned biblically like as per se it's prophesied about. But all of these other things, kind of including that last one, are all biblical. There's obviously a lot of other history that goes on with Jerusalem. That all kinds of things happen in Jerusalem historically. That's what the Crusades are all about, and all of those different things. That's Israel becomes a nation again during World War II. All of those different things. There's a lot of history that goes into this place, and yet this is the biblical history of Jerusalem. So a couple other things that I want to talk about. That's the history, but now I want to talk about this first mention of, I don't know why my slides have messed up there.
That's an interesting way to put that, son. I can't read it. But yeah, you can. That's the first mention, son.
Yeah, this is the first mention of Jerusalem. And for those of you that can't read what passage it says it is, this is Genesis chapter 14, I think verses 17 through 22, or maybe 24.
I'll check it. You go on.
All right. So it says, after Abram's return It actually says after his return, but I want to clarify who it was. After Abram's return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shava, that is the King's Valley. So a little background information. The kings in the area of the Dead Sea, Sodom and Gomorrah, had just gone to war with these other kings, and their cities had been captured, right? And Abraham's nephew Lot was living in Sodom at this time. So Abram's nephew is captured. He's taken away. And so Abram gets some of his allies together. He basically forms this small army, and he goes and he rescues Lot and all of these different people that have been captured, all of their stuff, and he brings it back with him. They go back, and on the way, during their return, he goes out and he meets this king of Sodom, which is what we're talking about here. So it says he meets the king of Sodom in the King's Valley, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, 'I have made Abram rich.' I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share." So you basically had this story, and the only real mention of Jerusalem in the story is the fact that it says that Melchizedek is this king of Salem, right? So they're not even in Jerusalem at this point. It's happening in some valley somewhere. I don't actually know where it is. I probably should have figured that out before talking about this. But they're in this valley, the Valley of the Kings. And the only real mention of Jerusalem, again, kind of in passing, right? That it just says that this guy named Melchizedek comes out, and he's the king of Salem, and he's priest of God Most High. And he brings out bread and wine and blesses Abram.
So am I to take it then that this is the first mention of the city of Jerusalem? In my Bible, the footnote actually says this is Jerusalem. So obviously we've got a lot of scholars who concur. But my question is then, this is actually the opening name, one of the opening name that we have for this particular city is Salem. And so it's going to evolve into Jerusalem. But at this point, it's Salem.
Yeah, it's going to change. So whenever Joshua captures it, it's called Jebus, and then I think it changes again. I'm not sure, but so you've got different names. Obviously, we've got Mount Moriah also. That's that kind of name, and so there's different mentions of this place without using the name Jerusalem until later on. So you have this story, which again briefly mentions this guy named Melchizedek. He's really not even in that much of the story, right?
Right. Gets a lot more attention in Hebrews than he does here.
He does. His name is only mentioned the one time in the story, and then he talks a little bit. He just says this blessing over Abraham and over God, and then he's done. He never mentioned again until Psalms. Right? So, even though, I don't know, even though this story is kind of odd and it doesn't get a lot of airtime at this point, it does become important later on. Right?
Definitely.
Definitely. There's a couple of interesting things about this story, I think. First of all, I would say what Melchizedek actually does. So Melchizedek comes and he blesses Abraham, right? He says this blessing, "Blessed be Abraham, by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who's delivered your enemies into your hand." So he says this blessing over Abram, and then it says, "And Abram gave him a tenth of everything," which is interesting because it fulfills this promise that God makes to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. Right? So God in Genesis 12 says, "I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse." And so there's kind of this idea that if anybody blesses Abraham, they're going to get this blessing. And that's exactly what happens in this story.
Good point.
Melchizedek comes out and he blesses Abraham, and then he's blessed by Abraham by getting a tenth of the spoils. The other interesting thing about that is what's mentioned in Hebrews, which is the fact that, first of all, it's always like the greater person that blesses the lesser person.
Right.
And so Melchizedek obviously is greater than Abram.
Which is a pretty big statement.
Yeah. And then he's paying tithes. Abram is paying tithes to Melchizedek. It's interesting. He gives specifically 10%, and he gives it to this guy who's a priest. And so there's kind of that connection there of, for some reason, Melchizedek, even though he's never mentioned again in this book, right, he, for some reason, is more important than Abraham is. So you kind of have that question of, like, who is this Melchizedek guy?
Yeah.
And what I find really interesting about all of this is the fact that it says that Melchizedek is both this king of Salem, and he's a priest. He's priest of God Most High. And so basically Melchizedek serves later on as this representation of what Jesus is.
Sure.
That Jesus is both this king of Jerusalem, right? And he's both this king, and he's also a priest. And those are both interesting things for us, I think, because if Jesus is a king and he's a priest, that means, or high priest rather, if he's a king and he's high priest, then that means he needs both a kingdom and he needs other lesser priests to be in charge of, right?
Good point.
That's what it means to be a high priest, is you're the head priest, the most important one. And so for us, that means that we are, number one, the kingdom of God.
Cool.
Like we're the new Israel, that we are these people that God is ruling over, and so our lives become about that, right? That we have this king who's ruling over us, and so it's more than just like Jesus comes and he saves me of my sins. He saves me for a reason, so that I can be a part of that kingdom, that he can rule over me. And then number two, I'm a part of his priesthood, and so I'm set apart to be this holy person who goes out and does priestly things, which is kind of the mission of the church, I would say. That's what it means to be a missionary. That's what it means to be a Christian. Is you are this priest who goes out and he brings the people to God and brings God's message to the people.
Wow, that's good. I've been studying personally in the book of Numbers, and I find it intriguing that in the camping arrangement, the tribe of Levi was to be at the center. The priestly tribe was to be at the center. At the center of them, of course, is the tabernacle, meaning that everybody faces in. They set the trend. They are the ones who are, they surround the most holy place where, you've got God appearing in the cloud and the pillar of fire, etc. Not unlike the church today. We set the bar. We are everybody really, if you think about it, they do face the church. Whether they're paying attention to us or we're selling the values correctly or not, they face the church, and we set the bar, whether it be in America or any other country.
Yeah.
And so we need to be individuals like you're saying here that recognize that significance. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing is the king of Sodom seems to be like directly contrasted with the king of Salem, Melchizedek. So they both come out to meet Abraham, and yet Melchizedek blesses Abraham, and Abraham reciprocates by giving him this blessing. And then the king of Sodom almost seems like he kind of tries to bless Abraham, right? He says, you give me the people. So he's kind of bartering with him here. But he says, you give me the people, I will give you all the stuff. Which you kind of, you're the one that won this battle. You deserve the spoils, that kind of thing. But it seems like, he's trying to bless Abraham. And Abraham, he blocks him from doing that. He says, right. No, actually, I don't want your money. Just give me the stuff that my men have already eaten, and let these other guys, my allies, have their share. But I don't want any of your stuff, because I don't want you to be able to say that you made me rich. So Abraham is blessed by one person, Melchizedek, and then he blesses him in return. And then this king of Sodom, he tries to bless Abraham, and Abraham basically says, I don't want you to be blessed, and so I'm not going to let you bless me, which is kind of interesting. I think that shows a little bit of the power that we have as people.
Wow.
That there comes this blessing with being somebody who blesses a child of God, right?
Yes, definitely.
And so, if we want to bless somebody, sometimes the best thing that we can do for them is allow them to bless us.
Wow.
Which is obviously the opposite of what Abraham actually does here. But I think that's an interesting idea for all of us.
And may I go the other side too? We know Sodom. We know the condition of Sodom. We've just had the story of Lot, and we know what's happening in Sodom. And do you think that some of this is that Abraham wants to kind of keep his distance from that kind of a character, that kind of I don't want to be beholden to a man who is the king over a place that's so warped, so perverted that God's eventually going to send fire and brimstone down upon him. That kind of a thing.
Yeah, it definitely seems that way. And Abraham seems pretty compassionate to Sodom's plight, I guess you would say.
He does.
He goes and he rescues all the people of Sodom, it seems like, at this point, or however many got captured.
Right.
He goes and he rescues them. He's going to be the one that barters with God to say, if you find 10 people in Sodom,
right.
Would you rescue them? Or rescue Sodom, that is. And so, Abraham, actually, I think that's Abraham taking his job seriously. Right?
I agree.
I agree. That God has commissioned Abraham to be this man who is blessed so that he can be a blessing. And so Abraham takes that seriously enough that even though he sees the wickedness of Sodom, he recognizes that it's my job to intercede on their behalf. And so again, I think that applies to all of us. That as children of Abraham through Jesus, we have that same responsibility of looking at this dying and lost world, like the world of Sodom, and interceding on their behalf.
That's convicting. That's a convicting thought.
All right, so that's the first mention of Jerusalem in the Bible. The next kind of idea I want to talk about is the temple at Jerusalem, because it's really, I think, the thing that makes Jerusalem so important.
Agreed.
Is the fact that God's presence is there in Jerusalem. So we kind of talked a little bit about this last week, John chapter 4, verses 19 through 23. So I'll try not to belabor this point. But we talked last week about this idea that the temple was different than the way that we see worship today, right? So that's you got this idea that there was a time period whenever the people all thought that there's this one place where you're supposed to worship. We actually kind of already talked about this tonight, that with Jeroboam, that he's setting up these golden calves because he doesn't want his people to go back into Jerusalem to be worshiping God. So there's kind of this idea that the people had that there was one right place to worship God. And we don't really have that idea anymore, I would say. Maybe like church buildings, we would say, are like the right place to do it. But even then, if this one church building isn't the right place for you, we'd say, well, would you go to a different one, or let's build a different church building. So there's not kind of this idea of location being as important. Obviously, we wouldn't say even the church building's really that important, but there's not this location that really holds our worship anymore. And we talked about all of that last week. But the point I want to make now is that because of that, we kind of had this skewed understanding of what worship was like back in the day, because we picture worship as being the way that it is now all the time.
Yeah.
And so, we think of worship, and I think we tend to think of it as, well, God is everywhere. And so if I go somewhere and I want to worship God, he's right there where he can hear me. That there's kind of that idea. Whereas it seems like in the Old Testament, there's more this idea that God actually is in a certain place, right? He is actually in the temple. And so if I want to worship God, if I want to be near God, I need to go to that place.
Even like Jacob back in the day, it seemed like he traveled specifically out of his way to places because that's where I last met God. Mm-hmm. It's like the portal to heaven. And so I'm going to go there to talk with God, mm-hmm. rather than this, like you say, Christian idea that we just take God with us. We can pray without ceasing because he's everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. So they don't seem to have quite that same understanding of God. So this is the Tower of Babel. You wanted pictures, so
I appreciate that. Probably not the best rendition, but that's what modern artists think of, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. It was probably more like a pyramid ziggurat type thing.
Right.
But
we had to have an illustration, son.
We had to have an illustration.
Thank you for doing that.
No problem. So there's this idea in, I guess, ancient Near Eastern cultures that temples would have been different, not just from the way that we see them, but also, it seems, kind of from the way the Bible tends to talk about them. So what I mean by that is it seems that in most ancient Near Eastern cultures, what they would do with this temple is they kind of try to appease this god. Like they would build this temple so that this god would make it his house, and he'd be kind of bound to that place, right? He would have to be in that house, and then I would go and I would sacrifice to him, and then he'd like have some obligation to do something for me because I made this sacrifice to him. And so there's kind of this business-like manipulative side to these interaction with these gods. And you can kind of see this in the story of the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
So Genesis 11:4 says, "Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.'" So it's interesting that the way they talk about this, it seems like at first glance their motives are pure, right? Maybe not their motives are pure, but what they're trying to do is a good thing, right? That they say, let's build this tower with the top in the heavens. Like, it seems like they're trying to build a temple, right? And they're trying to build this temple so that they can go up to where God is, or maybe so that God can come down to them, right? So it's this temple idea, that they're building this so that God can come down to them, down to this temple. And yet, even though that seems like a good motive, they immediately say, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. They say, let's make a name for ourselves. They say these ideas that are pretty clearly contrary to what God actually wanted. Mostly because God said, fill the earth. Like, he wants them to disperse, and that's what he does by the end of the story. And so it seems, kind of had these contrasting ideas of, are we building a temple here, or are we going against God's will? And I think the answer is just kind of like they're just going against God's will in general, right? That they seem to be building this temple from this idea of we can manipulate God into helping us. Wow. And so we're going to build this temple to manipulate God into like making this name for us and not dispersing us over the face of the planet. And so they try to do this to manipulate God. But the children of Israel, at least the Bible, doesn't seem to have that same idea. The children of Israel eventually get to that place where they're also trying to manipulate God. Whenever Jesus is throwing over tables in the temple, he says, my house shall be called a house of prayer. You make it into a den of robbers, right? That's kind of quoting this idea from prophecy that would have been that these people go in and this is from Jeremiah chapter 7. The people would have gone into the temple as like this safe haven, right? So outside of the temple, you do whatever you want, and yet we recognize God's in the temple, so I go into the temple, and there I'm safe, basically. Is that kind of idea. So he's not necessarily saying, it's wrong to sell things in the temple, although that seems to be kind of the implication. But, what he's really saying is, you guys go and outside of this place, and you do all of these terrible things, and then you come running here thinking that God's going to rescue you because you're in his presence, and that's not how it works.
Yeah.
And so eventually they do get to this place of not understanding how the temple is supposed to work at all. And yet it seems like at some point they kind of understand, or at least the biblical authors understand what this temple is for. So Isaiah chapter 30, verse 29, it says, "You shall have a new song, as in the night when a holy feast is kept, and gladness of heart, as when one sets out to the sound of the flute, to go to the mountain of the Lord, to the rock of Israel." So Isaiah is trying to describe what this ultimate joy is going to be like, right? He's talking about the restoration of Israel, and he's saying, if you guys turn back to God, this is what you're going to get. And the way he describes this joy is by saying, it's like whenever you go to Jerusalem, right? Like whenever you go to where the temple is, that's the kind of joy that you're going to have. And so it seems like Isaiah essentially can't come up with anything better or more joyful than going into the presence of God. And so that seems to be kind of the idea, is that the children of Israel, rather than viewing the temple as this place where they have God bound, that he has to do their will, and they can manipulate him into doing the things that they want, rather than seeing it that way, they see the presence of God as this gift, right? So Isaiah says this about, this is where the greatest joy lies, is in Jerusalem. Psalm 65 says, "Praise is due to you, O God, and Zion, and to you shall vows be performed. O you who hear prayers, to you shall all flesh come." So Isaiah talks about this idea of Jerusalem being this place where your joy lies. Psalm 65 talks about the fact that the Israelites view God as being in Jerusalem, right? And so whenever they're going to Jerusalem, the fact that they're joyful has everything to do with the fact that God is there, right? And so that kind of becomes the idea of the temple, is that the presence of God is this gift that brings joy. And so this temple is the representation of God's presence. And yet there's kind of this odd separation that the children of Israel have, even with the temple right there in their presence, between themselves and God. So this is Exodus chapter 33, verse 9. Obviously, this is actually talking about the tent of meeting. We're going to talk about the tabernacle here in a minute. So not exactly the same as the temple, but essentially the same. So Exodus 33, verse 9, it says, it's talking about Moses with the tent of meeting, that he goes out away from all the people, the children of Israel, and he sets up this tent. And then it says, when Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. So it's interesting. It doesn't say the pillar of cloud goes into the tent. Actually, it says Moses is inside the tent, and God stands right outside the tent, and they have like this conversation through the tent flaps, almost, right? So there's this separation between God and Moses. And Moses, at this point, is the only person that's talking to God.
Right.
Like the children of Israel said, we don't want to have anything to do with God because we're afraid of him, so you go talk to him. on our behalf, Moses. And Moses even is separated from God. He's inside the tent and God's outside the tent. And then there's the reverse of that in Exodus chapter 40, verses 34 through 35. It says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle."
Wow.
So, kind of seems like the cloud filling the tent of meeting is basically kind of saying, like, we're not using this anymore, so you can't go in here anymore, Moses. But then, like it says, the glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle, which is interesting because, like you were just pointing out, the whole camp of Israel surrounds the tabernacle, right? So, the Levites are at the center, and really the tabernacle is at the center. So God is right there in the center, in the midst of his people, and even then, God's people are all on the outside, and God's in the tent now.
Yeah.
Right? So it reverses the whole story that now God's in the tent and everybody else is on the outside. And yet there's still that separation.
Yeah.
There's this separation between God and his people. And that separation continues throughout all of the Old Testament until eventually, as we talked about, 486 BC, Jerusalem falls, the temple is destroyed. Ezekiel 10 says that the glory of the Lord leaves the temple. And so the presence of God leaves Israel, essentially. And by the end of the Old Testament, it's not really clear if God's presence has come back, right? They've rebuilt the temple. It's not quite as good as it used to be, but they rebuilt it. They rebuilt Jerusalem. And yet it's not really clear. Did God come back? Is God actually with his people again? And so the hope of Revelation is honestly more hopeful, I think, for the children of Israel at the end of the Old Testament than it is even for us, right? So Revelation 21, verses 22 through 26 says, "And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb. And the city has no need of a sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. By its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it, and its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. They will bring into it the glory and the honor of the nations."
Wow.
So he says a couple of things. He talks about what we talked about last week with this idea of this light, that God is going to be this light that draws all of the nations in. And he also talks about this idea of there is no temple in this city.
Yeah.
Because God is the temple.
Yeah.
And so there's this idea that there's no more separation, right?
Right.
The presence of God not only has returned to his people like they wanted it to in the Old Testament, but it's even better than it was before. God's not inside the tent with us on the outside, or us inside the tent with God on the outside.
Yeah.
Now we're just together.
Yeah.
We are all in the same place. God is with us now.
Powerful.
And yet, that's our future hope, right? And yet I said that the children of Israel needed that hope more than we do, right? And there's a reason for that, which is that we have this other hope as well. This is Matthew 18, verse 20. It says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among them."
Wow.
You could also look at Matthew 28, right? The Great Commission that Jesus would say, "Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age." That the children of Israel at the end of the Old Testament are wondering, is God with us? And we don't have to wonder that anymore.
Yeah.
God is with us, and he's going to be with us more fully, right?
Right.
Now we're like Moses standing in the tent of meeting with God on the outside, and we're kind of, we're in communication with him, and yet not fully, and yet we also recognize that we have God right there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Anytime that 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among them. And so, in this moment right now, like, we're gathered together, two of us in God's name. We're having this podcast. Anybody out there that's gathered with their people watching this, God is right there in their midst, right? And we have this presence of God, and these little mini temples almost.
Yeah.
Any time that we gather together with other believers. And ultimately, the church as a whole is the new temple of God, at least for right now. We are that place where people go to be in the presence of God. And so we kind of become this new Jerusalem, right? That the church becomes today's Jerusalem, even though there is an actual city of Jerusalem today.
That's good.
All right, so that is the lesson on Jerusalem's geography.
Powerful stuff.
I got 5 questions here for our SBS students. So, what was Jerusalem first called in Scripture? What are the 2 dates given for the destruction of Jerusalem? What's the significance of Melchizedek being both a priest and a king? What made the way that the Jews viewed the temple different from the nations around them? And how can we be in the presence of God now? I think those are all, at least that last one, I think is a pretty important question. That I think we tend to think of the presence of God as being this place where we always are, and that's kind of true. But it was also kind of true in the Old Testament, and yet they wanted more than that, right? They wanted this temple.
Yeah.
And so how is it that we can really find ourselves in the presence of God?
Good stuff, man. Jerusalem. Woo. I like it.
Well, thank you. Next week, we're going to be talking about the Dead Sea.
Oh, yeah?
So I don't know if I have anything interesting to say about that.
Dead Sea.
I might have used all of it up on Jerusalem, because we talked a little bit about the Dead Sea. We didn't actually talk about the location of Jerusalem in this.
Maybe we could tie that in
could.
Relationship to the Dead Sea.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, so next week we'll tell you where Jerusalem is on the map, because we forgot to do that this week.
Yeah.
All right. So that's the show.
Next time.